Hi, my name is Oswald Sobrino, and I'm the author of this book, Paul and Roman Slavery Under Nero's Rule. And there's a depiction of Paul from an icon. This is the second book in a series on Roman slavery and Nero. The first book was on Seneca and Roman slavery, and there's a separate video on that, which I did earlier. This video covers Paul and Roman slavery. So let me read from the introduction to give you a preview of the book. This book on Paul and Roman slavery under Nero is the second book in the series that begins with my book on Seneca and Roman slavery under Nero. Like the first book on Seneca, this book on Paul is based on my 2022 doctoral dissertation completed at the University of Florida Department of Classics. I have written both books for scholars and general readers. I define terms that seem quite basic to specialists because I'm trying to reach general readers. This outreach to general readers is essential, as I said in my previous video, if scholarly work is to enrich society and to remind all citizens that reflecting on ancient culture and history is essential to the good life and to a good society. And reflecting on ancient history is not just merely of antiquarian interest in the ivory tower and its conferences. I have closely modeled this book on Paul and my earlier book on Seneca with adaptations as needed. The books are part of a series and meant to be read together by those interested in both Seneca and Paul. Although one can first read with understanding the Paul book, you can read this book on Paul first with understanding. This book on Paul periodically points out relevant ideas from the first book on Seneca. So you can read it independently. You can read it first independently of the Seneca book. Read it first because I do point out what is relevant to it from the Seneca book. But the Seneca book provides historical background for this book on Paul. Paul's historical background as being within the Roman Empire, as being a contemporary of Seneca and Nero in the 1st century AD. So the rich historical background you can find in the Seneca book is profitable when you come to the Paul book, although not absolutely essential. Why a book on Paul, Roman slavery, and Nero, in addition to my first book on Seneca and Roman slavery under Nero? It is obvious that Paul and Christianity retain a powerful presence in both Western and non-Western cultures. Paul remains a focus of interest as one of the most eloquent and pivotal figures, foundational figures in Christianity. Slavery is also, as I said in my earlier video, much in our minds today when we see the tragedies of human trafficking, slave labor, and of a prison system that some in the U.S. view as a legacy of American slavery. Nero was the Roman emperor who presided over the deaths of Paul and Seneca, and Nero remains a symbol of absolute political power gone mad, although he was not the only emperor who shared in that political madness. In addition, as another reason why this book on Paul is necessary, is those interested in Paul and Christianity cannot help but ask what led Paul to accept ancient slavery despite his emphasis on the dignity in Christ of a newly converted slave. This question is at the heart of this book, as it was in analogous form at the heart of my earlier book on Seneca, who emphasized the dignity of slavery, but Seneca did it from a Stoic perspective. Paul emphasized the dignity of the slave because the slave was, as a convert, a brother in Christ. I argue that Nero, as the political slave master of the Roman Empire, plays a decisive role in explaining why Paul accepted Roman slavery. And this question is raised, and it's important because the question of why Paul accepted Roman slavery is compelling because Paul, like Seneca, wrote eloquently about slaves and non-slaves sharing a common human nature. Paul, more specifically, wrote eloquently about slaves and non-slaves as one in Christ and as worthy of close friendship as brothers in Christ. And the short letter to Philemon by Paul in the New Testament is central to looking at Paul's views on slavery. Seneca, Paul, and Nero thus go together in Roman history. They were all contemporaries. And Seneca and Paul tragically died at the hands of Nero. Paul was executed under Nero, and Seneca basically was executed, but the means of the execution was that Nero simply ordered Seneca as an alleged traitor to commit suicide. So both were high-minded people, important people, great thinkers, and both died at the hands of Nero, and both basically were almost identical contemporaries living the very same decades. So they all go together. Seneca was the tutor and close advisor of Nero. Unfortunately, Nero eventually suspected Seneca of a conspiracy against him and ordered Seneca to commit suicide. Paul made his way to Rome as a prisoner of the Romans and was ultimately executed under Nero according to Christian tradition. In addition, Paul wrote the weighty and important letter to the Romans that remains his most important theological work in the eyes of many. The fate of Seneca and Paul under the absolute domination of Nero reminds us of the dangers of political authoritarianism today. Most importantly, reflecting on ancient slavery as confronted by Paul and Seneca leads us to reflect on our own forms of slavery today. If this book can lead us to question our modern forms of enslavement, then I will be fully repaid for my efforts. So Paul and Seneca, what are their attitudes towards slavery? Seneca was a Stoic philosopher, not a Christian. So we ask, well, the Stoics believed in a common human nature. The Stoics believed in reason, and Seneca viewed slaves as sharing the same human nature as non-slaves. And Seneca wrote eloquently urging slave owners to treat their slaves kindly and with dignity and respect, and to even consider them friends. Paul, from the Christian perspective, wrote eloquently about slaves and free sharing equality, being one in Christ. And Paul urged in one of his letters, 1 Corinthians, Christian slaves that if they could, to escape slavery, not escape in the sense of violating the law, but if they could purchase their freedom from slavery or accept freedom from their slave owner, not to violate the law. And Paul urged one slave owner, Philemon, to treat his slave as a brother, as a friend, as a brother in Christ. So why did these men still accept the legal institution of slavery? I propose and contend that the reality of Nero as the political slave master of the Roman Empire was decisive in Seneca's accepting the institution of Roman slavery and Paul accepting the institution of Roman slavery. You could call it realpolitik, the realities, the practical realities of that time and that society. But both men have left a legacy of humanizing the slave and encouraging respect and kindness toward the slave. And I think both men today would be very happy that the institution is gone, at least in the form it had at the time they lived. So there it is, volume 2 of the series on Roman slavery under Nero, first book on Seneca and Roman slavery under Nero, the second book, Paul and Roman slavery under Nero. Both men are tied together by time and circumstance, and unfortunately they're tied together by their dealings with Nero. So there it is. I hope you take a look at it. It's been made accessible. My dissertation was on both Paul and Seneca, but I've split the research in two parts to make it accessible for general readers. Thank you very much.